Good morning, I'm DIANE MACEDO. Thanks for streaming with us. We want to get right to the latest on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the new rocket attacks. New video shows a major strike near Freedom Square in Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv. Here is the aftermath. As Russia escalates its attack, the country is now being accused of war crimes for targeting civilians as a massive military convoy heads toward the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. This as the humanitarian crisis worsens. The UN Refugee Agency says at least 677,000 people have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries so far. And the UN says there's a growing number of unaccompanied and separated children among those refugees. UNICEF says there are reports of families arriving at the border, handing over their children to border guards, and then remaining in the Ukraine. The Ukrainian military and militias made up of civilian soldiers have put up a tough fight against Putin's forces. But now the Russians are bringing more force. Let's bring in senior investigative reporter Aaron Katersky in Ukraine, along with ABC's Elizabeth Schulze in Washington for more. Aaron, the Russian Defense Ministry says that strikes with precision-guided munitions ruled out damage to civilian infrastructure and apartment blocks, but video appears to show otherwise, that video coming out of Kharkiv. So is this disinformation?
Well, look, we're not really sure because we haven't had a look up close, but the Russians are saying they're not targeting civilian infrastructure. The Ukrainians said plenty of civilians have been killed or wounded, as many as 400, and that's probably a low estimate at this point. The Ukrainians also accused the Russians in an earlier bombardment of Kharkiv of using cluster munitions to maximize civilian casualties. Many countries outlaw cluster munitions, although not around here. And it's really worrying because as the Russians have suffered some setbacks in the early part of an invasion that has not gone to plan, the fear is they will rely more on heavy artillery, less on precision-guided munitions, and be a little more indiscriminate about their targeting. That there's some history there with the Russians. Think back to Chechnya, and so there's some real fear of what the Russians may have in store.
And Elizabeth, given those allegations against the Russians, Secretary of State Antony Blinken addressed the UN Human Rights Council earlier and openly questioned whether Russia should be allowed to keep its seat on the council. Let's listen.
One can reasonably ask whether a UN member state that tries to take over another UN member state while committing horrific human rights abuses and causing massive humanitarian suffering should be allowed to remain on this council. If President Putin succeeds in his stated goal of toppling Ukraine's democratically elected government, the human rights and humanitarian crises will only get worse.
So, Elizabeth, could Russia actually lose its seat on the Human Rights Council? And how significant would that be if it does happen?
Diane, it's unlikely this would happen, certainly overnight. But what this is significant is that it shows it's part of this larger effort to isolate Russia from the community internationally, this diplomatic front to make Russia on its own as the rest of the nations kind of bond around this idea that it is a pariah here on the diplomatic stage. You know, we heard Secretary Blinken there reference the human rights violations. He says they are mounting by the hour, specifically referring to that attack that we saw in Kharkiv, saying it is very clear if you look at that this is there's going to likely be evidence of human rights abuses here. And it's something that the UN is messaging as well, not just on the ground as far as the military operations, but also the need to pay attention to the refugee front for additional humanitarian and military aid. This is a clear focus right now from the rest of the UN, as well as from Secretary of State Blinken.
And Aaron, what is the latest on the fighting there? How are things looking at this point?
Well, we've seen some fairly significant blasts in the suburbs of Kyiv, the capital. In Kharkiv, again, an administration building came under attack from what appeared to be a missile, and there was a giant explosion that did catch some civilians in that fire. It happened after curfew. And now it's getting dark a bit, and it looks like another long and restless night ahead. We've seen satellite images of the large convoy that's coming in from Russia, tanks and troops and artillery pieces. And if it's true, as U.S. and Western defense officials fear, that Russia really does plan more devastating attacks on this country, that's going to mean more time in basements at a moment's notice, or sheltered, and it's taking a real toll on the population. I was at the main Lviv train station today when a train all the way from Kharkiv came in, and it has to go back. And I was talking to the conductor. He said he's really scared to go back into that restive area, but he's committed to trying to get more people out. Before the train left, it wasn't going to go empty. An army of volunteers came with water and food and diapers and loaded it onto the seats where passengers had been, because they know that that city's going to need resupply.
And Elizabeth, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy is applying now for his country to join the EU, and he's calling on European leaders to prove that they are with Ukraine by doing this. What are the chances that the EU does accept Ukraine under the circumstances, and what impact could that have?
Well, Diane, this is certainly the message from President Zelenskyy, that you should show that you stand with us, the EU, by admitting us in through this expedited process. And essentially, the EU has said that it's open to this. It hears this message. You know, President Zelenskyy made an incredibly emotional appeal to EU lawmakers, saying that we are fighting for democracy here. And he was met by a standing ovation from many of the lawmakers in the room, who clearly understand the position that he's coming from. That said, the process of actually joining the EU is incredibly complex. On its own website, the EU says that it's something that does not happen overnight. So getting this on this kind of expedited basis that President Zelenskyy is requesting is not something that would be easy. There's a general process in place here. It requires integrating countries into the European market. And ultimately, it's something that would not happen perhaps on the scale that President Zelenskyy is hoping for, as we are looking at this by the hour, by the day here in Ukraine.
And Aaron, the UN is now saying over 600,000 Ukrainians have fled the country and crossed into nearby borders, into nearby countries. But what is this like for those who've stayed behind? Because we do know that there are a number of Ukrainians who are still either at home or somewhere in their local cities bracing for this.
Diane, could you imagine being a man of fighting age and seeing off your kids and your wife and letting them go to some other country, not knowing when you're going to see them again, and not exactly knowing what your role in the resistance is going to be? There's a lot of pride, and there's certainly a willingness of people to take up arms in defense of Ukraine, and I think they've been emboldened by some of their early successes, but no one's under any illusions about how long they can possibly hold out. We've seen a determination here, though, to take up arms, to make Molotov cocktails. I even was with a group of volunteers sewing camouflage nets for the frontline military units to use. They're ripping fabric and out of donated clothes and stitching them together to make these camouflage nets. And one woman told me she can't pick up a weapon. She doesn't know how to use a gun, but she has hands, and that can be her contribution.
Yeah, we know some are even doing things like baking bread, you know, round the clock, so that soldiers and anyone else in need will be able to have it when the time comes. We're also hearing reports from UNICEF now that some are showing up at the border with their children and handing their children to border guards and then going back into Ukraine. So, Elizabeth, the latest estimates now coming from the UN are saying this could be up to 4 million people in the coming days displaced by this conflict. How is the U.S. planning to respond to the humanitarian crisis angle?
Well, we know that the State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House have already kind of issued this third package of relief. That includes military aid, but they're also focusing on the humanitarian aid as part of that. You know, part of the problem is actually getting supplies to the area, getting it where it needs to go. But there is no doubt a push here, and there's a push in Congress now to authorize additional aid on the humanitarian front. People are looking at these photos and understanding the severity of what is happening and wanting to help. And that's a message that we are hearing here in Washington from lawmakers, from the White House too. Diane.
All right, Aaron Katersky, Elizabeth Schelsey, thank you. And more citizens are fleeing Ukraine as the attacks ramped up. As I mentioned, more than 500,000 people have already crossed into neighboring countries, and the UN now says this crisis could amount to 4 million in the next few days. Phil Lipoff is in Lublin, Poland, and has been following their stories directly. Phil, what are you seeing and hearing there?
Well, Diane, we are hearing and seeing despair and fear and uncertainty and sadness, and it's only growing and getting worse. We're in Lublin, Poland, which is a city of about 300,000. Up until 4 or 5 days ago, it was business as usual. We are about an hour and a half away from the closest border crossing. We've been to that border and we've seen the activity increase by the day. But only within the last 48 hours have we really seen the activity here. And when I say activity, I mean Ukrainian refugees coming here an hour and a half away from the border to Lublin. And they are staying in hotels and they're staying with friends and family. We've spoken to many of these women. And Diane, as you know, they are mostly women and children and some elderly men, but their husbands and brothers are back fighting. We've spoken to many of them. I want to introduce you to a woman named Olia. Now, I could tell you her story, but hearing it from her is something else. On the steps of Lublin City Hall, Ukrainian refugees, women and children, singing their national anthem, an act of defiance and a desperate plea for help. Singing through tears, holding their children tightly, displaying their country's colors and pain on their faces. In the middle of it all, we find Olia with her 2 children, Alexander, 7, and Ariana, just 3. Olia speaks her native Ukrainian, but here, across the border, she answers our questions in Polish. Coming here was to keep them safe.
Tak, my przyjechaliśmy tutaj tylko zaraz dzieci. My po prostu mamy nadzieję, że my, nie wiem, że to wszystko się skończy 3-4 dni. My po prostu chcemy do domu.
In her heart, she knows that won't be possible. Showing us these pictures of her husband with their kids, she must believe he will be okay. Right now, he's fighting the Russians. This war, the refugee crisis, too big to shield her children from. Not even little Ariana. It's almost too much to take.
Oni wszystko wie. Moja córka, ona wie, co w Ukrainie. Ona mówi, mama, tato będzie żył? Mama, gdzie tato? Mama, czemu nie ma tata? Mama, kiedy przyjdzie do nas tato? Mama, ja chcę do domu, ja chcę do tata. Mama, tato teraz trzyma automat, oni wszystko wie.
All this mother can do is pray for her husband, her country, and protect her children here in Poland.
To was drugi dom I traktujcie nas jako swoich przyjaciół.
A safe place, the mayor here says, where refugees can stay as long as they want. And when I ask what Olia needs the world to know, we note something in her response.
Dobrze, my chcemy dla України wszystko najlepszego. Ми chcemy, żeby był мир в Україні. Ми не хочемо, щоб Росія на нас нападала.
When she uses the word peace, she suddenly begins to speak Russian, a poignant reminder that most everyone in this region is connected in some way, a reminder that no matter what the language, the message of peace, hope, and safety is the same. So we spoke to Olia for about 15 minutes, and obviously she was very emotional during the interview. To hear her cry while she talks is one thing, but all of us who are my producer here, Nate, our photographer, Peter, Igor, we all heard the stress you could hear in her voice. And Diane, you heard her there in the story say she hopes it's 3 to 4 days. It's been 3 to 4 days. She's staying here in Lublin, Poland, and there is no end in sight.
And Phil, you mentioned there that Olia suddenly started to speak Russian. How does that work into this whole thing? How closely connected in some ways the people being attacked are to the people attacking them?
Diane, it's a great question, and it's something I hadn't thought about. But while we were doing the interview, our photographer Peter noticed that she slipped into speaking Russian in the middle of that sentence. And when she used the word peace, she used the Russian word for peace. Eastern Europe is connected by history and some dark history at times, but it's also connected in a way by language. Take Ukraine, for instance. If you live in the east of Ukraine, most Ukrainians there will speak Ukrainian, but they will also speak Russian. You live in the West, a lot of Ukrainians will speak Polish because they have friends and family over in this area. They work in this area. They come over on vacation here in this area. It was interesting speaking to Olia because she knew that we weren't speaking Russian here, so she spoke Polish. And just when she said that word peace, she used the Russian word for peace, but it was noticed by our photographer that she noticed it. And she switched back to Polish immediately.
And Phil, the new estimates coming in now from the UN we could see up to 4 million people displaced in just the next few days. So how are neighboring countries like Poland going to handle that?
Well, Poland's been preparing for more than a week now. They have 123 of these reception centers that are ready to receive Ukrainian refugees and help them transition to a shelter if they need to, or get them to their friends and family here. Already here in Ukraine, Diane, there are about 2 million, in Poland, there are about 2 million Ukrainians living here. So a lot of these refugees coming this way into Poland will have friends and family, but we're at 400 and something thousand right now. You're talking about 4 million. I mean, there's a refugee crisis right now. It only gets worse. I will tell you, and this is a very small gesture, but it's what we're seeing and what we will see on a larger scale here in Poland. We were in Lublin's Old City today, and we walked past a restaurant, and there was a sign, and in Ukrainian, it said, we have solidarity with the people of Ukraine, and we have free soup if you had to flee your home.
All right, Phil Lipoff in Lublin, Poland. We appreciate it, Phil. Thank you. Coming up, President Biden is just hours away from delivering his first State of the Union address. What we know about how he might tackle the Ukraine-Russia crisis, the pandemic, and more right after this quick break. Welcome back to ABC News Live. We have more on the war in Ukraine in just a moment. But first, here are some of the other stories we're following for you this morning. President Biden is set to deliver his first State of the Union address tonight, tackling the Ukraine-Russia crisis and other issues. When it comes to the economy, the White House says the president will focus on increasing domestic manufacturing, strengthening supply chains, and reducing costs for families. ABC News Live will bring you full coverage of President Biden's first State of the Union address tonight, starting at 8 p.m. Eastern. A new study suggests that Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine was less effective in kids than teens and adults. The study shows that in New York State, at the height of the Omicron surge, the pediatric dose of the Pfizer vaccine for children 5 to 11 was less effective than in teens and adults who got the full dose, providing minimal protection against infection a month after vaccination. But the vaccine still dramatically reduced the risk of hospitalization in children. And the road to midterm elections starts in Texas, where primary elections will be decided for governor, attorney general, Congress, and more. Governor Greg Abbott faces challenges from the far right over his handling of the pandemic, but he's expected to win the Republican nomination, while former congressman and presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke is expected to be the Democratic candidate. Meanwhile, Texas's restrictive new voting law seems to be having an effect. Thousands of mail-in ballot applications have been returned, and early voting has seen low turnout. And the cast of Don Carlos lined up on stage at the Metropolitan Opera here in New York on Monday night for a tribute to the people of Ukraine. The cast took the stage to sing the Ukrainian national anthem, with the audience standing in solidarity for the performance. Coming up, meet two Ukrainian heavyweight boxing brothers who are now fighting to defend their country. More on that after the break. Welcome back. We're taking a closer look now at two Ukrainian brothers who fought their way to the top of the heavyweight boxing world. Now they're taking on a very different opponent. Patrick Reevell has their story.
Vitaly Klitschko was a decorated heavyweight champion.
Down goes Johnson. And that is a great performance for Vitaly Klitschko.
And now he's the mayor of Kyiv, at the helm in a very different fight for his country. Kyiv, until a few days ago a relaxed, vibrant capital, is now a city facing a siege from Russian military forces, seeing the early signs of a potential humanitarian crisis. Supply lines are disrupted, meaning shortages for both food and medicine. These patients are waiting in the basement of a children's hospital, afraid to leave for fear that outside only worse awaits them.
We're running out of food. Local charity funds promised to bring some. We are waiting for them to come and bring us bread, essentials, and some juice for children.
But despite facing tens of thousands of approaching Russian troops, residents are taking up arms to defend their city. Ordinary people lining up to pick up assault rifles, anti-tank grenades. Mayor Klitschko is helping organize the defense with one message for the Russians.
Go back home. You have nothing to find here.
Klitschko, along with his brother Vladimir, who was also a heavyweight champion, has vowed to defend Ukraine. Once fighting for glory, now they're in the fight for their city and country. 5 years apart, both brothers dominated the sport, with Vitaly becoming world champion in 1999 and Vladimir in 2000. Although as a promise to their mother, they've never fought each other. They both earned PhDs in sports science, getting them the nicknames Dr. Steelhammer and Dr. Iron Fist. Vitaly retired after a 13-fight winning streak in 2012, deciding to enter into the world of politics, eventually becoming mayor of Kyiv in 2014. They're pleading with the international community for aid and more sanctions.
Don't let it happen, continue happening in Ukraine. Don't let it happening in Europe and eventually in the world.
With more Russian forces continuing to advance towards Kyiv, the brothers are trying to rally the defense, sending out messages through their social media accounts, reminding Ukrainians of their strength.
Тільки разом ми вистоїмо. Слава Україні!
All right, our thanks to Patrick Reevell for that report. And as President Zelenskyy of Ukraine tries to inspire his country and the world in that fight against Russia, his wife is also helping to rally support. Will Reeve has more on the First Lady of Ukraine.
As her husband rallies international support and leads and defends Ukraine from the front lines, Olena Zelenska stands stout, protecting her family. The 44-year-old wife and First Lady to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy posting messages of solidarity to her people on social media, writing, "Ukrainians are no mob. We are an army."
Standing by your people and by your country when you are a personal target, how can that not inspire? How can that not impress?
Zelenska and the future president met at university. She was training to become an architect, he a lawyer. Later, as Zelenskyy shot to television fame, Olena became a writer for his comedy troupe. The two married in 2003. The mother of two reportedly had reservations about her husband entering the political arena, but she would soon come around and become his biggest supporter. Zelenska quickly making a name for herself through humanitarian causes and her personal sense of style, regularly showcasing Ukrainian designers, appearing in fashion magazines like Vogue Ukraine. Her initiatives span from kids' nutrition to gender equality, part of an ever-growing portfolio for Zelenska. Her last post from an undisclosed location featuring a child born in a bomb shelter, a message of hope for fellow Ukrainians, writing, "Despite the war, there were doctors and caring people on our streets next to her. She will be protected because you are incredible, dear compatriots." In another post she made as the war began, Zelenska showed the same resolve that so many Ukrainians have in recent days, writing, quote, "I will not panic or cry. I will be calm and confident. My kids are watching me. I will stand by them and with my husband and together with you. I love you guys. I love Ukraine." Diane?
All right, Will Reeve, thanks for that. And I'm Diane Macedo. Do stay with us as ABC News Live continues with news, context, and analysis. We'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.